Hey, welcome along to another selection from Mark's Mailbox. These are questions from Mark Steyn Club members around the planet that we didn't get to during our live Clubland Q&A session the other day. We always have a few good ones that rattle in toward the end of the show, so we're rounding up a few of the best ones and getting to them right now. First up, from Matthew Williams. Matthew writes, Mark, one observation from your discussion with Lindsay Shepherd that I found interesting was that in her view, the left-right division within politics seems to be based entirely on the position one takes with respect to a variety of social and cultural issues. For example, pro-gay is a left-wing position and anti-gay a right-wing position, or so we are led to believe. Historically, political debate had always been about the proper scope and role of government, with totalitarianism at one end of the spectrum and anarchy at the other, and one's politics were largely defined by where one fell on that continuum. Where you fell on that continuum would be based at least in part on your opinions about things like free speech, property rights, etc. Opinions on things like race and gender within a society were generally held in common across the political spectrum. Did you get the impression that Miss Shepherd and her classmates even understand the basis of political debate in this traditional sense? Well, that's what happens when you lose, Matthew, because you can have a debate between left and right, between totalitarianism, total government on one hand, and anarchy at the other, when you have small government. But the bigger government gets, the more everything becomes part of government. And in fact, the more we assume that it's entirely natural for government to run healthcare, for example, to take care of your elderly parents, for example, the more politics itself becomes a battle between things that would not have been considered political at all a century or two ago. And that's how it is with all the identity politics issues that bedevil us today, such as sexuality and Islam and all the rest of it. That is politics, largely speaking, to Lindsay Shepherd's generation, because the minute that becomes politics, it presupposes that everything is political. The personal is political, as the feminists used to say. So I'm old enough to remember when gays were witty, amusing, slightly transgressive people who were happy living on the fringes of society because it gave you a lot more freedom to be witty, amusing, transgressive and everything. If you'd said to them in a couple of generations' time, being gay will mean suing some Christian baker in Oregon for refusing to bake you a wedding cake, they thought that was nuts. There's no point. Who the hell wants to go through their life suing Christian bakers to marry you so you and your same-sex husband can be deacons at the local congregational church? You might as well be straight if you're going to be that boring. In fact, I would argue that in that sense, contemporary American leftism has totally bored all the fun out of homosexuality, as old-time gays would have seen it. But the fact is, that's a political identity. I don't even know whether they still have sex. Do they? I don't know. Can anyone tell me? Whether they do, they also have an explicit political identity. And you have competing political identities. In my book, America Alone, I quote the case of Sir Iqbal Sakrani, who's a moderate Muslim of such exemplary moderation that he's been knighted by the Queen. He was head of the Muslim Council of Britain, Sir Iqbal, and he got a little bit carried away on the BBC, and he started saying that homosexuals were totally immoral and spread disease, and this was totally unacceptable. And so as a result, Sir Iqbal got investigated by Scotland Yard for homophobia. And at exactly the same time, the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Alliance, another London group, said that Islam was a balmy religion that was totally homophobic. So then Scotland Yard investigated them for Islamophobia, if you follow me. If a Muslim guy says that Muslims don't like gays, he gets investigated for homophobia. But if a gay guy says Muslims don't like gays, he gets investigated for Islamophobia. May the best man win. I don't know how that came out. I don't have a dog in this fight. But what that tells you is that the more people are defined in terms of identity groups, the bigger government you need as the only legitimate arbiter of relations between those groups. So by definition, you need a big government to mediate between all those competing identity groups, such as when somebody decides they're going to put the gay bar next to the mosque or whatever. So in a sense, the fact that this is what politics is now is because small government types have lost the battle, and this is what we argue about. On a related subject, Owen Morgan writes, British Conservative MP Ranil Jayawardena was condemned for opposing chain immigration, and a Labour Party critic offered this criticism. Many will wonder how someone from his background can have developed such views. In other words, stay on the reservation. How does the left get away with its right through the bone marrow racism? You make a very good point, Owen. I take it, I've never heard of this guy. He's a British Tory MP. I take it from his name, he's Sri Lankan. I don't know whether he's a Sri Lankan born in Sri Lanka or whether he was born in Mother England or whatever, but he's got a Sri Lankan name. And I'm not going to look him up because I'll make this point. This is the other danger of identity politics, that simply by virtue of the identity group he is deemed to belong to, he is assumed to have a particular set of views. So this Labour Party MP seems to be complaining that somebody of Sri Lankan origin is not allowed to oppose chain migration. In fact, it's entirely, I happen to be an immigrant to the United States, and I don't believe in chain migration. I don't think any country, any developed nation needs mass migration. I think it ought to pick and choose individuals, and that those individuals should be able to bring spouses and minor children, and that's pretty much it. The idea that simply by virtue of belonging to certain groups you are obliged to hold certain views is one of the bedeviling factors of identity politics. James Patey wrote, any thoughts on the conviction of Count Dankula, the Scottish YouTuber who has just been found guilty of a grossly offensive Nazi dog skit? This is a chap in Scotland, if you haven't been following this story, who taught his dog to give the Nazi salute, the Sieg Heil, to annoy his girlfriend. In fact, it might even have been his girlfriend's dog. I don't really care. The point is, when you're prosecuting jokes, you're the Nazi. It's not actually much more complicated than that. They used to write novels about it. I often quote Milan Kundera's great novel about post-war communist Czechoslovakia, in which a student makes an ill-advised joke to his girlfriend and his entire life is ruined. In this case, a guy trains his dog to make an ill-advised joke to his girlfriend, and his entire life is ruined. And I don't even think Milan Kundera would have seen that coming. David Letterman, when he used to be on television, used to have a feature called Stupid Pet Tricks. A dog you can train to go Sieg Heil, to do the Nazi salute, is an excellent pet trick. I don't know whether the dog did the whole full raised arm or that little camp mini, just flip of the wrist Sieg Heil that has sort of faintly, actually not faintly camp hair, it has a sort of flagrantly camp hair. There's a lot of camping about with those Nazi guys. But the point is, we are living in an age in which jokes are actionable. And that ought to be absolutely horrifying to anyone in the United Kingdom. And I would say, actually, my old friend John O'Sullivan, who was Mrs. Thatcher's speechwriter, he used to joke that the police were the paramilitary wing of the Guardian. It's actually gone beyond that. Before, the problem with the police was always that if you went into the toilets at Piccadilly Circus, there'd always be some unconvincing, burly, beefy type in a white polo neck sweater with policeman's boots sticking out of the bottom of his leather pants, coming on to you as you were standing at the pissoir and trying to entrap you into making eyes at him. Now it's completely the opposite. As insane as they were down one end of the spectrum just a couple of generations ago, they're now equally zealous and crazed at the other end of the spectrum. So we have police who are looking for hate crimes all the time. In a country where girls go abused for year after year after year and the coppers do nothing, and in a country where cars ride up on the sidewalk and mow down pedestrians, in a country where you get blown up if you go to an Ariana Grande concert, but they'll get you for teaching your dog how to give the Nazi salute. As I always say, in Britain, everything is policed except crime. Let's see. Oh, does anybody wonder if John Brennan, this from David Geiler, maybe Giller, says, does anyone wonder if John Brennan's outburst was prompted not by Andrew McCabe, but by the appointment of new heads of the CIA? And Scott Scherzer, who's really on a related theme, says, Mark, now that it is obvious that the deep state is even deeper than the Marianas Trench, is there any hope of extricating ourselves from bureaucratic control in our lifetime? That's my old joke from After America, that you don't need a president for life if you've got a bureaucracy for life. That is essentially what has happened to almost all Western nations since the end of World War II, the entrenchment of a permanent bureaucratic apparatus. It's worse in the United States because the US has the most developed high-tech surveillance security state. So what's interesting to me about John Brennan, who, for non-Americans, he's a former deep state intelligence honcho, from the CIA, and former director of the CIA. And he's basically, after Andrew McCabe was fired for leaking and for giving knowingly false testimony to the, as deputy head of the FBI. And Brennan is tweeting that when it all comes out, Trump will be revealed as this corrupt liar, all the rest of it. This is not an appropriate way for former heads of intelligence agencies to behave in free societies. There's actually something very Latin American about it. It's like the police chiefs in the reflector shades in South America always threatening guys that they've got the goods on you. I mean, basically, Brennan is saying that in his previous job, he knew a lot of dark secrets. And he still knows those secrets, and he can damage you with those secrets. And Samantha Power then piled on with that, saying, you don't want to mess with John Brennan. John Brennan's supposed to be a civil servant. He's not supposed to be someone who uses secrets to threaten people. That is Banana Republic 101. And so when the left is admiring of Samantha Powers for saying, don't mess with John Brennan because he can get the goods on you and destroy you, they're actually telling you something about who they are and where they are today. These all-seeing surveillance states, the security state, as we've just learned in recent weeks, they investigated the Attorney General without his knowledge, the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, just to see if he'd been lying and leaking about something. These are the same useless twerps who can't do a thing when the Russians finger the guy who is about to do the Boston Marathon bombing. That they can sit on and do nothing about. The big money, no object security state, they can't do that. They can't get that guy. They can't get the panty bomber whose dad fingers him to the CIA. They can't get the panty bomber until he's over Detroit on Delta trying to light himself up. But they can sit around, bureaucrats, civil servants, can sit around figuring how to get the goods on serving American cabinet secretaries. The deep state here is out of control, and people need to take back the organs of their government from the permanent bureaucracy. Mitchell Young says, Sir Roger Bannister died 2 weeks ago. No mention from Steyn? Sir Roger, actually Mitchell Young, I see he says Dr. Roger Bannister. He was actually knighted. Sir Roger, he was like a huge, for my generation, he belonged to that huge he was one of those boyhood heroes who cast long shadows. He was the first guy to run the 4-minute mile. And he belonged, I would say, to that last generation of heroes in the dawn of Queen Elizabeth's reign, including Sir Edmund Hillary, who climbed Everest became the first man to climb Everest, the great New Zealander, Sir Edmund Hillary, on the eve of the Queen's coronation in 1953. And if you're not English or New Zealander or from anywhere in the Commonwealth, you'll know Sir Edmund Hillary because when he met Hillary Clinton, she said that she had been named after Sir Edmund, and that's why Hillary has 2 L's. And in fact, Hillary, I believe, was born in 1948, when Sir Edmund had yet to climb Everest and was in fact an obscure New Zealand beekeeper. Hillary's parents, naming their child after an obscure New Zealand beekeeper, apparently they were the only Illinois subscribers to the New Zealand apiarist. It's really quite impressive. But I always feel sad when I think about chaps like Roger Bannister and Edmund Hillary, the great heroic figures from the dawn of the Queen's reign, and you look at the sad state. It's too sad when I look at the imperial metropolis today. Speaking of which, Raj from Ontario, Raj writes, "Hi Mark, thousands of girls over decades were and are still being brutalized in, among other places, Telford in Shropshire, by Asian grooming gangs. And the BBC is worried about about the overworked bureaucracy. Here's what their headline reads: Telford abuse, concerns over youth workers' caseloads. Raj, you make a very good point. One of the ugliest aspects of my visit to Rotherham in South Yorkshire to meet the victims of the Rotherham grooming scandal. Almost all the girls I met, young women now, had appalling complaints about the indifference of the so-called social workers, the people who are paid taxpayers' money to care for them, and the wider group of institutions that are supposed to look after these girls. For example, as I mentioned, one of the so-called foster mothers who came to a deal with the grooming gangs that she didn't care what you did with the girls as long as you got the girl back by 10 o'clock at night. This is in Rotherham. She is still on the approved list of foster mothers in Rotherham. I was told about another social worker with the council who punished those girls who did not fall into line. For example, by confiscating the passport of one so that she was not even able to, she lost her, whatever it was, £1,000 deposit on a summer vacation she was going to take. The behaviour of the social services, I don't know about Telford, but I do know that the behaviour of the social services in Rotherham is controversial, has been appalling, and the reaction of the local government institutions there has been self-serving and has contributed to the cover-up. And I'm sorry the BBC feels that the victims in this are the bureaucrats. The victims in this are, non-grooming Muslims who might unfortunately find their reputation suffers by being associated with them. The victims are the huge amount of human wreckage caused by the appalling behavior, not just of their tormentors, but of their collaborators. Not just the rapists, but the police, the politicians, the social services who turned a blind eye to it for years and continue to turn a blind eye to it. And there's a callousness and a heartlessness, Raj, when you look at the BBC's attitude to these people, to the victims, to the girls, to the women who suffered at the hands of these men. This is the same BBC, by the way, that employed all these elderly disc jockeys who copped a feel on Top of the Pops in 1973 and who it turned tail on and is happy to now see that they're hounded into court for groping the schoolgirls on BBC television and radio shows in the early 1970s, but has been largely indifferent to the hell that the girls of Telford and other places have gone through. Let's see, what else we got here? We always like to, I don't like to do all the grim stuff. It's been mostly grim stuff. I'll tell you what, let's make it even grimmer. Here's a question from our longtime musical correspondent in Los Angeles, Daniel. I think I gave him a little bit of a Quebecois pronunciation last time. Daniel Holom. I'm not sure how Dan says it, but he references the fact that I'm always asked to do Beatles songs for our Song of the Week. I never want. I'd like, if you want a Beatles song, there's a zillion websites, there's a zillion radio shows, there's a whole ton of them that will give you Beatles songs. So I did a Paul McCartney song he wrote for Cilla Black the other week that I've always liked, Step Inside Love, because who doesn't love Cilla, who doesn't love Step Inside Love? And Dan writes, hello Mark, you wrote, of course there aren't really any Lennon and McCartney songs, there are Lennon songs and McCartney songs, and a small number of songs that are 90% Lennon, but McCartney chipped in with a suggestion for the tag, or vice versa. And Dan chides me, because he knows about some of this boomer pop stuff. And Dan writes, up until 1965, there were quite a bit of 50-50 efforts, including 4 of their biggest hits, From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and 8 Days a Week. As most, even lower to mid-level Beatle-philes know, pretty much whoever is singing lead was also the primary composer. On just about every song where the 2 of them are singing in unison throughout, it was a half-and-half collaborative effort. From 1965 onward, that pretty much stopped, although there were a few incidences of Paul writing the verses and chorus and John cooking up the bridge. We Can Work It Out, with a little help from my friends, I've Got a Feeling, etc. The other way round was not as common, but there were a couple of famous ones, A Hard Day's Night and A Day in the Life, says Dan. And Dan, I didn't know all of that. I knew 70% of it, but the point is, I was making my breezy generalization because I don't care. As I said, everybody, if there are a zillion people who've devoted their lives to analyzing Lennon and McCartney songs in detail, in a detail that neither Lennon nor McCartney could ever be bothered with. And I always take my cue from the guys themselves. I can't remember whether it was John or Paul who said this, but either John or Paul or John, whoever it was, said, there are 2 things we always do when we sit down to write a song. First we sit down, then we write a song. That's all I need to know, Dan, but thank you for your letter anyhow. We will be back I lost control over there. We'll be back, as Porky Pig would say, with another edition of Mark's Mailbox very soon. If you gather that there is a spring in my gait, that is because I've recently come to the end of an interminable lawsuit. And so I am full of the joys and the gaiety of spring. I might even sit down and write a song about it myself. Thank you very much for your support for the Mark Steyn Club as we have endured an unnecessary year of tedious litigation. It's over, it's done, and we will see you next time.